The sun hung low over the crimson sky of Zareth, its light refracting against jagged peaks of obsidian and casting long, foreboding shadows across the plains. Beneath this alien tableau sprawled the village of the Orith, a towering race of warriors and hunters. Their stone-hewn dwellings, built into the cliffs, shimmered faintly from bioluminescent moss, creating an ethereal glow that mirrored their fierce yet beautiful inhabitants. Among them stood Katera, a figure both revered and feared. Katera was unlike any other in her tribe. Standing over 10 feet tall, she towered even among the Orith. Her silver skin shimmered in the dim light, her eyes glowing like twin moons. Her strength was legendary, her prowess in combat unmatched. Yet, it was not her physical gifts that set her apart, but her untamed spirit. While others adhered strictly to the tribal laws, a rigid code dictating every aspect of life, from mating to leadership, Katera defied them at every turn. She refused to submit to the traditions that bound her people like chains, earning her both admiration and scorn. "Katera," a stern voice called, interrupting her thoughts as she sharpened her blade by the river. It was Vorin, her bondmate, and the tribe's second-in-command. His hulking frame cast a shadow over her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "You're needed at the council." "The elders grow impatient," Vorin said, his tone clipped, though his eyes betrayed his frustration. "I don't answer to the council," Katera replied, her voice calm but laced with defiance. "You answer to the tribe," Vorin snapped. "And the tribe is tired of your games." Katera stood, towering over him. "Games? Is it a game to refuse a life chosen for me by others? To seek something more than endless hunting and mating bonds dictated by tradition?" Vorin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Katera's words were dangerous. To question the tribe's customs was to question the very foundation of their existence. Far from the tribal cliffs, a human shuttle pierced the sky, descending like a silver bird into the heart of Zareth's wilderness. Jake Latham, a xenobiologist, gazed out of the viewport, his breath catching at the sight of the alien world below. The vast plains, glowing flora, and towering peaks were unlike anything he had ever seen. This was why he had joined the expedition, to explore the unknown, to bridge the gap between human curiosity and alien mystery. The shuttle landed with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped onto the surface of Zareth, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground. He adjusted his environmental suit, the air around him dense but breathable. The other members of his team were busy setting up equipment, but Jake's attention was drawn to the distant cliffs where the Orith tribe resided. He had studied their culture extensively, but the thought of meeting them in person sent a thrill through him. "You ready for this, Jake?" called Dr. Myers, the expedition leader. Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on the cliffs. "Ready as I'll ever be." The first meeting between Jake and the Orith was tense. The elders watched the humans with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their towering forms dwarfing the Earthlings. Katera, however, stood apart from the gathering, her arms crossed as she observed the newcomers. She had seen humans before, during their rare visits, but something about this group felt different. Or perhaps it was one man in particular. Jake felt her gaze before he saw her. When their eyes met, he froze. She was magnificent, her silver skin catching the light, her presence commanding yet untamed. But it was her eyes that held him captive, a mix of curiosity, defiance, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. Katera broke the silence. "You're not like the others." Her voice was melodic, her words heavily accented but clear. Jake blinked, surprised she was addressing him. I guess not," he stammered. "You speak our language?" she asked, tilting her head. "Not well," he admitted, offering a small smile. "But I'm learning." Katera regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Better than most." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, heart pounding. As days turned to weeks, Jake's presence in the village became less a novelty and more a source of fascination. He spent his days documenting the Orith's culture and ecosystem, always with a careful respect for their ways. Yet, it was Katera who occupied his thoughts. She was a paradox, fiercely loyal to her people, yet openly critical of their traditions, powerful yet restrained. Their paths crossed often, usually by chance. Each encounter was brief, filled with unspoken tension. Katera found herself drawn to Jake's curiosity, his willingness to listen without judgment. Unlike her tribe, he didn't see her as a symbol of strength or defiance, but as an individual. One evening, as Jake sat by the river, sketching the alien landscape in his notebook, Katera approached. "You draw?" she asked, surprising him. Jake looked up, startled. Yeah. It helps me understand things better." Katera sat beside him, her presence overwhelming yet oddly comforting. She studied his sketches, her sharp eyes picking out details he hadn't noticed himself. "You see more than most," she said softly. Jake glanced at her, his pulse quickening. I just see you." Katera's eyes met his, and for the first time, the wall she had so carefully built around herself seemed to crack. In that moment, the chasm between their worlds felt smaller, and the spark of something neither of them could name began to take hold. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight. Katera stood, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, human," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are not meant to be seen." Jake watched her walk away, a sense of longing settling over him. He had come to Zareth to study its mysteries, but he had found one far greater than he ever expected: Katera. By the time the night fell completely, Katera stood on the edge of the cliffs, staring at the stars. She felt a restlessness she couldn't explain, a pull toward something beyond the life she had always known. The human's words echoed in her mind, a quiet reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to the universe, and herself, than she had ever dared to dream. The village was silent as the first light of dawn crept over the cliffs, but Katera's mind roared with turmoil. Days had passed since her last encounter with Jake by the river, yet the memory lingered, sharper than any blade she had ever wielded. She had always been restless, but now that restlessness had a face and a name. Jake's presence in her life was not just a disruption. It was a threat to the very foundations of her existence. Voran's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You've been distracted, Katera." He stood at the entrance to their shared dwelling, his expression unreadable. As her bondmate, he was entitled to question her, but the coldness in his tone was something new. "I have much on my mind," Katera replied evenly, strapping a blade to her thigh. "And none of it seems to involve the tribe," Voran said, stepping closer. "Or me." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Perhaps that's because the tribe offers nothing but chains, and you, nothing but expectations." Voran's jaw tightened. "You speak of freedom as if it is something you can simply take. Do you even know what you're chasing, Katera? Or is it just the human who fills your thoughts?" Her silence spoke volumes. Without another word, she brushed past him and left the dwelling. Jake stood in the dense jungle outside the village, cataloging samples of alien flora. The soft hum of insects filled the air, but his focus was elsewhere. He had tried to bury himself in his work, to ignore the growing pull toward Katera, but it was impossible. Every glance, every word exchanged between them only deepened his feelings. "Human," came her voice, low and unmistakable. He turned to find her standing just beyond the tree line, her silver skin catching the dappled sunlight. "You shouldn't be here," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Katera stepped closer, her expression guarded. "And yet I am." For a moment, neither spoke. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. "Why do you seek me out?" Jake finally asked. Katera hesitated, the question cutting through her defenses. "Because you remind me of something I had forgotten," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What it feels like to choose for myself." Jake's heart ached at the vulnerability in her words. "Katera, whatever this is between us, it's dangerous. For both of us. And yet you don't walk away," she replied, taking another step closer. Jake closed the distance between them, his breath shallow. "Maybe I can't." Their connection, unspoken but undeniable, ignited like a flame. When Katera leaned in, her lips brushing against his, it felt as though the universe itself held its breath. Jake pulled her closer, their kiss an act of rebellion, of desire, of everything they had both denied themselves for so long. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments. In the quiet hours of night, Katera would slip away from the village to meet Jake by the river or beneath the sprawling canopies of the jungle. Each encounter was a respite from the suffocating weight of her tribe's expectations. But secrets could not remain hidden forever. Vorin was the first to notice the change in Katera. She was more distant, her defiance sharper, her absences harder to explain. It wasn't long before whispers spread through the tribe like wildfire. "Do you deny it?" Vorin's voice was a low growl as he confronted Katera one evening. The rest of the tribe lingered nearby, their eyes fixed on the pair. Katera stood tall, unyielding. "I deny nothing," she said, her voice steady. The gasps of the onlookers were almost drowned out by Vorin's roar of anger. "You would shame me, your bondmate, and defy the laws of our people for a human?" Katera's eyes flashed. "I would shame no one. I have chosen for myself, as I have always desired. It is you who cannot bear to see me free. You call this freedom?" Vorin spat. "It is betrayal." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of the elders, their imposing forms casting long shadows in the firelight. The eldest among them, Zorith, stepped forward. "Katera," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "You have brought shame upon us. Do you understand what you have done?" Katera's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "I have acted according to my heart. If that is shameful, so be it." Zorith's expression hardened. "You will answer for this." Jake had heard the commotion from his camp and arrived just as Katera was being escorted to the village square. The sight of her surrounded by the towering figures of her tribe filled him with dread. "Let her go," he called, stepping forward. The Orith turned to him, their eyes burning with disdain. "You have no place here, human," Zorith said. "This is not your concern." "It is my concern," Jake said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Katera chose me, and I chose her." The words hung in the air, a challenge that could not be ignored. Katera looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Jake, you shouldn't have come." "I couldn't stay away," he replied. Zorith raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "This is no longer a matter of individual choice. This is about the survival of our people. Katera's actions threaten the balance of our traditions. And what if your traditions are what bind you?" Jake countered, his gaze meeting Zorith's. Zorith's expression darkened. "You speak of things you do not understand." As night fell, Katera and Jake were separated. She was confined to a dwelling under guard, while Jake was escorted back to his camp with a warning never to return. Katera sat in the darkness, her thoughts racing. For the first time, doubt crept in her mind. Had she been selfish? Had her desire for freedom blinded her to the consequences of her actions? Yet, even in her darkest moments, she could not regret what she had shared with Jake. He had awakened something within her, a longing for a life beyond the confines of her tribe. Jake, too, wrestled with his own turmoil. The thought of leaving Katera behind was unbearable, but he knew that staying would only endanger her further. As the night stretched on, both of them faced the same question. Was their love worth the cost? By dawn, the village was quiet again, but the tension lingered in the air. Katera's fate hung in the balance, and Jake knew that his next move could change everything, for better or worse. Katera stood in the center of the village square, her hands bound with woven cords that bit into her silver skin. The elders loomed before her, their faces etched with the weight of tradition and judgment. Around them, the tribe gathered in a circle, their eyes a mixture of anger, disappointment, and curiosity. "This is not just a trial for Katera," Zorith announced, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "It is a reckoning for all who would put their desires above the survival of our people." Katera met Zorith's gaze, unflinching. "And what survival is there in a life without choice?" Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. Even those who condemned her could not ignore the truth in her defiance. Zorith's expression hardened. "Your rebellion has brought division. Your actions threaten the unity that sustains us. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" "I understand," Katera replied, her voice steady. "But I will not apologize for seeking a life that is mine to shape." The crowd murmured again, their unease growing. Zorith raised his hand for silence. You have betrayed your bondmate, your people, and our ways. The punishment for such betrayal is exile. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Katera's chest tightened, but she stood tall. If exile was the cost of her freedom, she would bear it. Jake had spent the night pacing his camp, his mind racing with possibilities. The thought of leaving Katera to face the consequences alone gnawed at him, but he knew his presence had already caused enough damage. Still, he couldn't stay away. As dawn broke, he made his way back to the village, his heart pounding with fear and determination. When he arrived, Katera was being led to the edge of the cliffs, where a narrow path descended into the dense jungle below. The tribe had gathered to witness her banishment, their expressions a mix of sorrow and resolve. "Stop!" Jake's voice rang out, silencing the crowd. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the towering Orith. "What are you doing here?" Vorin growled, his fists clenching. "I came for her," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "If she is to be exiled, then I will go with her." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Katera's composure faltered as she turned to face him. "Jake, no. You don't belong here. I belong with you," he said, stepping closer. "Whatever the cost." Zorith regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You would abandon your own kind for her? A bond that cannot last." "It's not about the bond," Jake replied. "It's about what she's shown me, what she's taught me. That freedom, real freedom, is worth any sacrifice." The elders exchanged glances, their stern faces softening just slightly. Katera's defiance had been a challenge, but Jake's willingness to stand beside her, even as an outsider, was something they had not anticipated. Katera's exile was carried out at first light. The tribe watched in silence as she descended the narrow path, her blade strapped to her side and a small pack slung over her shoulder. Jake followed close behind, his determination clear despite the enormity of what he was leaving behind. They traveled in silence at first, the dense jungle swallowing the sounds of the village above. It wasn't until they reached a clearing that Katera stopped, turning to face Jake. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice soft. "I couldn't let you face this alone," Jake replied. Katera studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, a small, bittersweet smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. "You're braver than I thought," she said. Jake chuckled softly. "Or just foolish." They continued their journey, moving deeper into the wilderness. The further they traveled, the more the tension between them began to ease. For the first time, Katera felt a sense of peace, even as the weight of her exile loomed over her. Days turned to weeks as they carved out a life in the wilds. Katera's strength and survival skills proved invaluable, while Jake's ingenuity and resourcefulness made him an indispensable partner. Together, they built a shelter, hunted for food, and navigated the uncharted terrain. In their solitude, they grew closer, their bond deepening in ways neither had expected. Yet, even in their newfound freedom, the shadow of their past lingered. One evening, as they sat by a fire under the vast expanse of stars, Katera broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving your people for me?" Jake shook his head. "I miss them, yes. But regret? Never." Katera looked away, her expression troubled. "I don't know if I can ever be the person you think I am." "You don't have to be," Jake said. "Just be you. That's enough." Katera's gaze softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. Months later, Katera stood on a ridge overlooking the jungle, the village far beyond the horizon. In the time since her exile, she had grown into the freedom she had always craved. She was no longer bound by the expectations of her tribe, nor the guilt of her choices. Jake joined her, his presence a steady comfort. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe someday," Jake replied. "But even if they don't, what matters is that you do." Katera nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free, not just from her tribe, but from the fear of being herself. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Katera and Jake stood together, their hands entwined. Their journey had been fraught with pain and sacrifice, But it had also brought them something rare and precious, a chance to forge their own path, no matter the cost. The future remained uncertain, but for Kotaro and Jake, that uncertainty was no longer something to fear. It was a promise of endless possibility, a freedom they had earned together.